Welcome everyone to our second Expo session. Just a reminder to fill out the session surveys in your app. And our next topic is called An Alert Fired, Now What? This is presented by Brian Dye from Corelight, CEO.
Thank you very much. All right, everybody, happy Tuesday. How are we doing? Yes. All right, oh yeah, we got some whoop. Oh, thank you for that, really appreciate it. As the title says, an alert fired, now what? So what I thought I'd talk about today is Corelight and Mandiant's recently announced partnership and kind of the why, the what, and the how. So what have we announced? Why is that important, right? Why is the Mandiant IR and Managed Defense team using Corelight's technology? And then, by the way, who are we anyway? Kind of where do we fit into this big picture? So just to get started, what we announced, it says today, but actually we jumped forward the press release, so technically it was announced yesterday, is that the Mandiant team is now going to be using Corelight's technology in their managed defense programs and in their incident response engagements. And I'll unpack more of why that is. And to enable that, the Corelight team worked with the Google Cloud Security Group to make sure that we're pretty well integrated into the Chronicle Security Operations Suite, as well as consuming the Mandiant threat intelligence. And we've been integrated for a while into the packet mirroring process. You can actually get that native traffic out of the Google Cloud platform and then analyze that. So if that's the announcement, the obvious question is why? Right? Because the Mandiant team's been doing investigations in endpoints, networks, all the telemetry they can for some time. Why do something specifically with Corelight, and why do it now? And it starts with what the role of evidence and what the nature of that evidence is for these defensive organizations, and especially advanced incident responders like Mandiant. Because you've got 4 canonical sources of data that an IR team is going to use to go and investigate. Right? The endpoint gives you depth. The cloud gives you some more context, the identity gives you kind of a nice blend, and then the network tends to be more purely on the breadth end of the spectrum. But really all 4 of those data sources let you run the gamut from depth to breadth to get as much context around a particular investigation as you possibly can. And regardless of which type of these 4 you're drawing off of, the role of the right evidence is critical, because it's what allows you to understand the totality of the attack, actually successfully resolve the investigation, and in the event that you actually have to get in front of, excuse me, an audit committee, heaven forbid, or a legal team, you can actually have defensibility of your findings. So the evidence is driving all of that. And Corelight in particular is helping Mandiant with the network side of this. Right? We're the company that's been the custodians of the Zeek project, formerly known as Bro, and so we've been kind of a canonical default standard in the network investigations world for some time. And to kind of double click on this, I wanted to use an example, because when I first joined Corelight about 5 years ago, one of my first calls was actually to an incident response consultant that happened to work at Mandiant, and I said, look, treat me like an idiot. Explain to me why this network data stuff matters. And he said, no problem. I'm assuming that was referring to the treat me like an idiot part of the conversation, but work with me on that one. And he walked me through an actual investigation that he had recently done. This was a large franchise organization, more than 10,000 different stores, that was notified by Visa that they had credit card scamming happening, right? They had point of sale terminals that were infected. And the actual attack that they were trying to unravel is in the red. Right? It came in at the time through phishing, no big surprise there. They established command and control. They had a pretty extensive set of lateral movement before they actually got to the point of sale terminals and started getting the payload and extracting the payload. Right? That's the attacker's view of this world. Let's look at the defender's view as they try to go and unpack that and kind of understand what was happening. Right? As I said, they didn't find this attack themselves. Visa actually found out and kind of let them know. So they knew they had a problem, they didn't know where it was. So they had to go and actually find out which of their more than 10,000 franchise locations, which were the couple dozen, by the way, that were actually impacted. So they had to find that first. Once they went and kind of really instrumented they actually started with a couple of hundred franchise locations, they could then say, okay, I found the malware, I found what the actual backdoor is, they got onto the point of sale terminals. They now had to go find out what was the rest of the attack chain. So how did they get there? You've got to walk through backwards through the attack. Walk through the lateral movement, find where they established command and control, find out who that initial phishing victim was. They literally had to unwind the different stages of the attack. At that point, they had to go and do the remediation, right? Not just rebuilding the point of sale terminals, but all the various kind of secondary stages that were along the way. And by the way, then they had to go prove to the audit committee what the actual scope of that attack was, right? And the consultant at Mandiant that was walking me through this story, he gave me the context of kind of where the network really played out. As you might imagine, the things that the network was most critical for were in the green, right? So number one was, how do you prioritize your resources? If you've got 10,000 franchises to start with, or if you think about a more traditional data center environment, if you've got 10,000 servers and you've got command and control beaconing out of one of them, where do you start? You're not going to start at the 10,000. You need to take your entire investigation scope and at least get it a little bit narrowed down. So the first place the network was super impactful was, instead of instrumenting 10,000 stores, they instrumented 300 stores, because they could look at where the potentially anomalous network traffic was that were around those stores. So that was step one, just raw prioritization. Step two is kind of what you'd expect, right? The network provides a set of signals that you can do for raw detection of traditional TTPs. So you can add that to what you're already getting from the endpoint, from your cloud and your identity, your other data sources to do context. I think that's more straightforward. That's kind of what people expect. But when they got into tracing the kill chain, actually accelerating that investigation became really important. Because what he was explaining to me was, the fact that the network data is all connected and it tells a consistent story of who went where and what did they do, that allowed them to trace the chain much more effectively than trying to connect the dots across 6 or 7 other different data sources that you've got to go imagine actually how they're connected. Now, the next piece I didn't see coming, because his point was, once you've got the kill chain and once you've actually rebuilt all these servers, rebuilt your point of sale terminals, your next paranoid question is, did I actually get the attacker out or not? Did I really discover this whole thing? So the network, because it's ground truth, gives you the confidence that if you're not seeing any of the lateral movement activity, any of the command and control beaconing, any of the previous indicators you've seen, even if it's elsewhere in your network, now you actually have confidence that you really have the remediation under control. And that was a really big aha for me, because I thought a lot about the TTPs and the investigation acceleration, right? That's what we think about traditionally when you're in front of the screen, you're looking at the alerting. But his point was, you don't stop there. You really look at the rest of the attack and you confirm the remediation. And then the last point was an even bigger aha. He said, we as Mandiant flew 16 people into this organization to help with this breach response. And that happened for about 17 weeks. At the end of that, 14 of the 16 left. 2 of them stayed. And they were joined by 4 lawyers. And I'm not going to comment on the Mandiant billing process, but if you think the Mandiant team's expensive, that's nothing until the lawyers show up. The lawyers make the Mandiant team look free, right? I mean, they're charging thousands of dollars per hour. And so they literally spent the next 3 months with the lawyers going through the defensible disclosure process and having to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt what their scope of disclosure had to be. And again, if you look at your canonical sources of evidence, some of those can be disabled, some of those can be bypassed. So it was really unique, the role that the network played in the defensible disclosure process when you are proving to an audit committee and proving to a legal team that has to report to the SEC now of what the actual scope of that disclosure was. And for me, that was personally a big aha, because again, I think so much about the analyst in front of the screen, how are they resolving that alert, how are they connecting the kill chain. But the bookends of this, right, the ability to use the network evidence to really prioritize an investigation, and then to actually use ground truth to prove defensibility at the end, was a heck of an aha. And it really is, this is the broader scope of the investigation. If you really think about this from a Mandiant point of view, the end-to-end view of an investigation, why they need all these different data sources, and in particular, why the role of network was so critical. So with that, the drivers for kind of NDR for projects, not just for folks like Mandiant, but again, for traditional enterprises, have become fairly obvious, right? And it really is these 3 big things that we've been talking about. Number one, you need visibility. Because if you don't have the right data to be able to look back in time and see what the scope of that analysis is, to be able to find the kill chain, to do retroactive discovery, retroactive detection, if you don't have the right coverage, you're not going to have visibility to do that level of analysis, right? You're literally blind. So that's step one. Step two is the obvious piece, right? There's a bunch of the MITRE framework that you can only see from the network, and you need that coverage, right? Traditional NetFlow and PCAP don't live up to those standards, right? You're not going to get the TTP coverage you need if those are your two dominant data sources. And then we just spent a bunch of time talking about accelerating the IR process. And the interesting data point I see with a number of defensive organizations is tracking what the percentage of successfully closed cases are. Because if you've got 3% of your cases that you can't close, right, those get closed unresolved, that means you don't know what's happening, right? It means that is an attacker that may still be in your environment. You know, maybe you've got command and control, but you actually couldn't find the full scope of the attack, so you had to reimage that C2 server. You've essentially hosed down the crime scene, right? So that is a really important metric that NDR deployments tend to help with. And kind of what's our role within that? We're a pretty unusual company, kind of on a couple of levels. The first is we're an open core based company, so we're the custodians of the open source Zeek project that used to be called Bro. If anybody needs to have a story about why we renamed the project from Bro, happy to follow up. But the short version is, honey, I'm going to Vegas for BroCon is not a sentence that works for anyone anymore. It was a great thing in the 90s when it was a George Orwellian reference to the dual-edged nature of network monitoring and the obligation that provides. Yeah, doesn't work now. No, BroCon, thanks for playing. So now known as Zeek, but we're the custodians of that project. We have because of that heritage of that project, which is amongst very elite defenders around the world, not just folks like Mandiant, but other IR firms tend to use it. It also tends to get deployed by incredibly kind of web scale tech giant style companies. We tend to serve a lot of very elite defensive missions, which is a real privilege for us. So we've done some pretty incredible scale. 1 terabit per second of production deployment is just a mind-boggling number. That's usually a telco style deployment scale, which we're privileged to support. And we tend to kind of view ourselves as a secret ingredient to a number of the large-scale SIM and XDR partners. So we work quite a bit with the Google and the Mandiant team, as we've talked about. We do a bunch of work with CrowdStrike. We do a bunch of work with Microsoft. Anybody who loves analyzing data tends to like working with us because we provide that great ground truth that tends to be helpful in connecting the dots, kind of as we were talking about earlier. So what we do as a platform is we tend to provide a lot of the raw telemetry that's incredibly important that comes off of a set of network sensors that we deploy across environments. That could be physical, virtual, cloud-based. We can even do a software-based deployment if you want to bring your own kind of sensor architecture. We think a lot on top of those sensors of what the evidence stack is. And I want to do a sidebar on this. As we've worked with these incredibly elite defenders that have self-engineered their own open source based deployments, we found that they were actually building a network visibility stack. So they can get the right combination of detection signal, data, whether that's metadata or files or even kind of some selective PCAP. So we've really been taking the design patterns of these incredibly elite defensive organizations, and then we're just packaging those up as a commercial offering. So I'd like to say that we don't view ourselves as being that smart, right? We've just taken the design patterns of the really elite scale defenders, and then we've taken that as our insight that we can kind of bring to the broader market. On top of that evidence, we bring a whole set of detections, not just things that you'd expect, kind of MITRE TTP coverage, but we also do a bunch of analysis of encrypted traffic. That's a pretty common thing for all of us at this point. Most of you and most of our customers as well are minimum 70% encrypted. So the ability to look inside that encrypted traffic and to find keystrokes, file transfers, brute force auth attempts winds up being super, super helpful, right? For example, if you see keystrokes over an SSH session, then there's only a couple of explanations for that. And by the way, if it's happening outside of your change window, now you've got a really thin level of explanations, because that's either a network admin doing something at a time they shouldn't, so that's a policy problem, or you've got someone doing keystrokes over a command and control channel, and that's definitely something you want to investigate, right? So kind of being able to look inside that encrypted traffic, we find is something a lot of our customers find a lot of value in. And the last layer is trying to automate as much of the triage workflow. And look, in a world where so much of our analysis and workflow happens in the SIM, we really view the role of the NDR as doing the alert and the triage workflow for the network-centric domain. And then we're still expecting a bunch of that analysis around broad-scale instant response and threat hunting to happen in the SIM. So we think a lot about how do we make the SIM successful, not just our technology successful, because we want to fit the workflow of the defenders that we're supporting and their mission, not having kind of a vendor view of, I want analyst eyeballs in my product. Like, that's not the way the world operates, not the way that your SOCs operate for sure. I do have one kind of special teaser in here that I throw out. There's a lot of talk at the conference so far, and frankly, I'm sure in all of your offices around generative AI and kind of what can be useful. Google's doing some really interesting things around their SecPalm project that we're excited about. A lot of you may be wrestling with ChatGPT and what do you do there. If you haven't already, check this out. Because the LLMs are generally trained on the public internet, you can go on ChatGPT today and ask it questions like, how would I investigate distributed DNS using Zeek logs? You can do that at home. You can do that in your hotel tonight. You'll get, if you do a decent prompt, you'll actually get some pretty interesting replies off of that. So one of the benefits for us of being open source based is that you kind of get this compatibility with a broader technical ecosystem. And it was a real aha for us. And I'll talk about Clint's session later here, but it was a real aha for us when we were talking to our own customer advisory board back in March. And we saw that really elite defenders, in many cases, even in large-scale financial teams, were using ChatGPT to accelerate their instant response investigations completely independent of anything we had done. So that's something that just, it works out of the box with ChatGPT today. And if you're not kind of, either you or your teams are not playing around with that right now, I'd highly encourage you to do it. The good news is things like understanding alert context and getting initial investigation guidance is actually pretty good at. The bad news is, once you get past the investigation guidance, it's trash. It is not good at the second order thought, right? If the wisdom of the crowd doesn't lead you in the right way, ChatGPT will not help you at that point. So just know where the hallucination effect starts to kick in. It'll be very obvious once you play around. But especially for teams, if you've got maybe a 5 or 8 person team that's trying to cover an entire kind of threat portfolio, you've got a huge range of technologies, it can be really helpful to kind of translate security into English, especially in some of these custom domains when you're having to cover a pretty broad range of technologies. And just to net out kind of where, the story of where we started, right? Why did Mandiant want to work with us? It's really because we share a couple of common philosophies, right? One is we believe that the right evidence is critical, right? You can have the best analysis platform, you have the best people on the planet. If you don't have the right data to look at, you can't figure this out, right? AI and ML will not solve the problem if you don't have the right data. So you need the right evidence foundation to begin. Second, detection is not an ML silver bullet. You need ML, you need behavioral, you need signatures, you need heuristics, you need all the analysis tools you can bring to the table, right? When you talk to the Mandiant consulting team, their view is, give me every detection you can, and I will tell you which ones I will rely on. But I want every detection you can give me, right? Which is something we deeply believe in as well. Third, again, we like to think that we're not that smart, right? But we work with a lot of people who are. And one of the big things we rely on is literally working with the Zeek open source community, because it's such a high-end, elite defensive community that we get contributions back. So we don't want the Mandiant IR team, we don't want our customers to be single-threaded on what we think is a good idea or what expertise we have in our labs and our research team. So it's been a real privilege to have contributions from MITRE, for example, who developed a bunch of east-west analytics, or Idaho National Labs that developed a bunch of industrial controls parsers, or Amazon, who actually developed a bunch of parsers and some detections for their warehousing, and then they've contributed those back to the open source community. Actually, a bunch of the early stage work on investigating encrypted traffic actually came from the Salesforce.com security engineering team that are big users of the open source tech as well. So again, there's a big community that's around this technology that is contributing, that Mandiant's a part of, and we like to be a part of as well. And then the last thing I close on, and this is obviously key for Mandiant as well, is each of you have a range of different deployment architectures, and our job is to fit it, not the other way around, right? And we try to really think about how do we have multiple different deployment architectures that will fit that model. So I'd finish here. A lot of folks ask me, where do you start with an NDR project? And there's a bunch of different ways to think about it. Some folks look at raw network visibility projects. A lot of folks look at their MITRE coverage. You could be doing a SOC modernization or automation program. But I'll tell you the biggest one is at the bottom. Because a lot of folks ask me today, not where I start, but where do I stop? What do I stop doing so I can actually spend time on this? And if you're sitting in an organization right now that's majorly using either PCAP or NetFlow for your security investigations, then you're living in what the world was best in class 10 years ago, to be perfectly blunt. And there's a better, faster way to run that investigation that's going to be easier for your analysts, and it's going to better integrate into your SIM. So if you're in that world, that's probably a big thing that you can stop doing that will actually help you kind of take some of these elite design patterns and move forward. So It's been a privilege to support Mandiant's mission. If we can help you either to understand what other customers are doing, we're happy to do that. We really think that we're part of this secret ingredient that connect the dots, and we've really been learning from the elite open source community as a result of it. And if you're looking for fun replays, by the way, there's 2 great sessions I'd point you to. One is our own Gene Schaefer, who did a great session on the SOC triad yesterday. I think that's going to be available. And then Clint did a really well-attended reception here yesterday that was actually doubling down on AI and some of the things that we're seeing there. So thank you all very much for the time. Really appreciate it. If anybody wants to follow up, the Corelight booth is right over there. It's a solid 15 feet, kind of across the wall. And hope you have a great rest of the show. Really appreciate the time.